You're listening to the VSL Aviation Podcast. I'm your host, Seth Lake. Whether you're listening on your favorite podcast platform sometime in the future or you're watching live on YouTube or Discord with us, welcome. This is our weekly installment where I answer your aviation questions. Most of these questions come through email and Discord. I think all of these actually came through Discord in one form or another tonight. If you want to join the conversation at Discord, you can head over to vsl.aero, where you'll find links to our Discord community. That's not behind a paywall, so anybody can join that. We'd welcome you there. We have a lot of good conversations throughout the week. You can also reach out to me directly at sethlake@vsl.aero if you have a question. If you're familiar with the YouTube videos or the previous podcasts, this weekly format is maybe a little different than what you're used to. Normally, I do the longer format kind of, these haven't really been short format. They're around an hour or over an hour long. But anyway, normally my normal podcasts are going over the airman certification standards, getting you prepped for a Checkride. These weekly podcasts are also doing that, but they're maybe not as prepared information, so kind of off the cuff, answering your questions. And I'm going to continue those ACS series videos as I have time. I get that question a lot, so if you're tuning in hoping to hear another ACS deep dive, keep tuning in. Those are coming soon, maybe even as early as next week. I'll get those recorded. So each episode starts with the week's top questions and wraps up with a live discussion on our Discord channel. You can also type in your questions on YouTube if you're joining us there, and we'll get that answered. I'll introduce John here in a second. I'm going to start introducing John at the top of the show so I don't forget. But John is a CFI up in the Northeast and helps me with the kind of the back end production here. And you may hear his voice on the podcast as well, or if you're on Discord. So, John, if you want to go ahead and introduce yourself, we'll make this maybe the standard practice of introducing everybody at the top of the show.
Yeah, we can certainly give it a shot. How consistent we actually end up being, it's to be seen.
Yeah.
But yeah, Seth introduced me already. I'm a CFI in New England, specifically in the Massachusetts area, the greater Boston area, if you will. And I'm also a fast team rep. So I do some things there. But yeah, you'll see me hanging around at the Discord a lot, and you'll hear my voice, asking questions that you guys ask for Seth live on the show. So if you have anything that you'd like Seth to discuss, leave it in the chats. And if I think it's worth discussing, I'll bring it up for Seth to discuss. But other than that, yeah.
All right. Well, thanks, John. I really appreciate your help. And as I said, you'll be hearing John's voice throughout the show. You may hear some other people that are joining us on Discord. It's kind of like a live call-in show. It's kind of neat. So we're going to blaze through these first 3 topics of the week and then move on to questions. Hopefully, we'll either generate some questions with the topics of the week, or maybe people are prepared with their own questions. We'll get to those. So to start things off, I want to get this out of here first because this actually was a pretty late-breaking question that came up, and it was in regards to a wet lease versus a dry lease. And the questioner is actually a customer of VSL with purchasing the ACE Guide. So Chad purchased the ACE Guide, and through kind of the Shopify purchase process, he sent in an email request, and I pointed him over to the Discord. So I think he's joining us here on the Discord tonight to hear this live answer here. So his question was basically, how do you explain to a DPE the difference between a wet lease and a dry lease? And I haven't talked to Chad that much, but I imagine he's probably coming up on a commercial check ride, and that's often a question that gets brought up during a commercial check ride, especially preparing for a commercial check ride. So if you're a commercial pilot in training or already a commercial pilot, wet leases and dry leases are something that maybe you've heard of before. If not, let me introduce you to wet leases and dry leases. So the first thing that I'd like to point out, because I always like to give references for everything that I talk about, is the Truth-in-Leasing document. And this is an advisory circular, AC 9137 Bravo. So if you're joining us on YouTube or Discord, you can see this pulled up. If you're on the podcast, you can just Google search AC 91-37 Bravo. And that is the current Truth-in-Leasing advisory circular. And it's a decent advisory circular. And in the back of this advisory circular, it has figure 1, which is the sample truth-in-leasing clause. So I've got this pulled up on the screen here, and you can see basically this is an example of what a dry lease should look like. And, this is required to be filed with the FSDO anytime that you're flying an aircraft that's over 12,500 pounds, or if it's a turbojet, turbofan aircraft. So this wouldn't be required if you were operating some sort of piston, twin engine piston. Let's say a Cessna 421. That's often a common one that maybe has multiple owners or might be involved in some sort of leasing scheme. It wouldn't necessarily be required to have a truth-in-leasing document or this lease filed with the local FSDO like it is for a jet. So let's talk about, first of all, let's define what a wet and dry lease is, and then maybe talk about some scenarios of why we would have this. So a wet lease is a lease that involves the leasing of an aircraft and at least one crew member. That's a wet lease. A dry lease is a lease that involves just the aircraft and no crew members. Now, the reason this may confuse, especially commercial pilots in training, is typically the term wet and dry is used in the context of Part 61 kind of training and Part 91 rental as does it involve fuel or no fuel. So that's a common misconception there, is that a dry lease somehow doesn't include fuel and a wet lease includes fuel. So that's a dry rental rate and a wet rental rate, totally different than a dry lease and a wet lease. So dry and wet in a rental rate, that typically refers to fuel. Dry and wet in a lease refers to crew members. A little weird that you're saying the presence of a crew member on the lease now makes that a wet lease, but whatever. That's just the term the FAA decided to use. Not that they always use the most clear terms. I don't think anybody's surprised there. But let's talk about why you would have a lease and then how these would function. And more importantly, what you need to know about the lease as the pilot in command to make sure that you don't get involved in an illegal charter inadvertently, because that's really what could happen here. That's what we're talking about. So the reason you need a lease, let's say this John person, John, let's say you go out, you win the lottery. I just called you a person. Sorry. I was trying to think of a random name and just your name came up. Sorry there. So John, the producer of the show, wins the lottery, goes out and buys a jet. And pretty soon thereafter realizes that the cost of that jet is pretty high, and he would like to maybe let other people use that jet from time to time and pay him for the use of that jet, and it'll help offset the cost, right? That's typically how this gets started, is you have got an airplane that isn't being utilized or it's really expensive and you want other people to utilize it, so you want to lease that out. So John could lease out his aircraft to, let's say me. Let's say I lease the airplane from John. Now, I start operating the aircraft. So that's the key term, is who is operating the aircraft. And this Truth-in-Leasing document actually provides us with some good questions to ask ourselves to determine who's in operational control. And that's in page 4 of the Truth-in-Leasing. At the very bottom, it starts to ask one of 4, and then it bleeds over to page 5. So there's 7 questions. So these 7 questions basically act as a way to clarify who's in operational control of that aircraft. And so let's think about it in real world terms. I lease this aircraft from John and I fly to somewhere and I land and I get ramp checked, right? There's a FAA inspector there and they're doing ramp inspections. And they walk up to the aircraft as soon as I land. And of course, they're going to ask to see the required documents. One of those is the registration, and the registration has John's name on it. And so they look at me and they say, "Hey, are you John?" And I'm like, "No, my name's Seth." And they're like, "Well, Seth, how did you get on this airplane? Because this appears to be registered to John." And I say, "Hey, no worries. I leased this plane from John. Here's my lease paperwork, properly filed with my local FSDO, and I also retained a copy to show that there's a temporary transfer of ownership, essentially. So John is transferring operational control over to myself, and I'm operating this flight. My pilot is up there, or maybe I flew it myself, doesn't really matter. As long as I'm maintaining operational control, the FAA is going to give me 2 thumbs up and say, hey, that's good to go. Everything's fine. So let's turn back time a little bit and I land. Same ops inspector walks up to do the ramp inspection. They ask for the registration. It has John's name on it. I say, I'm Seth. And they say, well, how did you get to be on this airplane? Well, I borrowed this plane from my friend, John. Well, now there's no lease that happened there. And so the FAA thinks that John's still in operational control, but I'm on the plane. So then the question comes up, well, what is John getting out of this? Is he getting any goodwill? Well, if I'm letting somebody use my multi-million-dollar asset, I would say that could, in theory, create some goodwill there. And the FAA defines anything as being compensation. So now John could be being compensated for me letting him use the airplane. And then the inspector may ask to talk to the pilot, and let's say the pilot is John's pilot even. So it sounds like John is operating an air taxi service, essentially. He retained operational control of the airplane. He retained control of the crew. So he's essentially doing sort of a wet lease now because he provided the plane and the crew to myself to use. And even if I'm not paying John directly, if he's benefiting at all, that could be seen as a form of compensation. It's not documented properly as a dry lease. I am not retaining operational control as John, so that's the key thing I keep coming back to is who's in operational control. So now I just operated this wet lease, or the pilot operated the wet lease. So now the FAA is going to say, hey, Mr. Pilot, I'm going to have to see your certificate. We're probably going to take some sort of enforcement action on that certificate, like a suspension or maybe a revocation if it's really negligent. At any rate, that's how something like that can go down. That's why you would want to have the proper lease paperwork on file as a commercial pilot. And then you really want to know, hey, is this a wet lease? If it is a wet lease, I want to start asking more and more questions because there are ways where a wet lease could be legitimate, but typically that's only going to apply if the entity that's in operational control has some sort of other operational certificate. So like a Part 121 airline or a Part 135 non-scheduled airline, I think they can participate in some sort of wet leases as long as their certificate allows for that. And there'll be higher levels of permission basically that have to happen within the FAA for that wet lease to take place. So the FAA won't say, hey, wet leases are completely illegal. That's not necessarily the case. It's just that most of the time, especially in Part 91 aviation, the only thing that's legitimate is a dry lease. So when you start talking about wet leases, that gets sticky. So Chad, for your example, where this might come up is borrowing an airplane. That's typically how this maybe lease structure starts to happen. Let's get back to the piston world because that's much more realistic than you going out and flying a Citation or a Falcon right now if you're just now getting your commercial. So let's say that you've been flying a Baron. You get your multi-engine rating and you're flying a Baron. And you're flying it for this personal owner, and let's say he's not even a pilot. He just hires you to fly him and his family, and you do that, and that's perfectly legitimate form of Part 91 contract pilot services, no issues at all. And you show up one day and it's not him, it's his friend. And his friend's like, oh yeah, I'm borrowing the plane and you're going to fly me now. Well, you have some serious questions to ask because are you saying that you're in operational control? Because if you are, you have to be a legitimate operator. So do you even know what the responsibilities of operational control entail? Do you know how to own an aircraft? And if that person that you're flying that you've never met before says, oh yeah, I've got an airplane 2 doors down from the hangar from yours, and it's down for annual right now. And so I've got this lease paperwork filled out. I found your name just through the network here of the airport. The owner of the plane isn't providing your name. I'm writing you're just doing this as a contract pilot. If you don't want to do it, I'll call another pilot, but I just figure I'd have you do it because you know the airplane. So there's 2 checks being written. There's a clear Lease document, and the checks being written is one for your pilot services is going to you, the pilot, and one is going to the aircraft owner for the use of the aircraft. And then typically that's also the person acting in operational control is going to write some other checks to pay for fuel. Now, again, that doesn't specifically mean that that's a dry lease, right? That just is crew related. But another thing that we can go back to that Truth-in-Leasing document is one of the question is who determines whether fuel requirements, who directly pays for the fuel? So paying for the fuel is something that the operator does. So that'd be a question that I ask the person that I'm flying in the back that is quote unquote leasing the aircraft. So if the person that's leasing the aircraft starts saying, "Oh yeah, Seth, just let me borrow this airplane. I really, normally I fly like Delta. I've never flown in a small airplane before." Seth said that or the owner said that there's a credit card in the glove box of the plane. I'll just use that to pay the fuel, and I'll reimburse the owner when I get back. If that's the kind of questions that you're getting out of your passenger, then red flags should be popping up. It's like, wait a second, this person doesn't know how to operate an aircraft, right? Which doesn't mean they're a pilot, right? You don't have to be a pilot to operate an aircraft. Or to exercise operational control, right? There is no training you have to go through to be a person in operational control. So it's really up to you. And the reason it's up to you as the pilot in command is the NTSB has said so. The NTSB and the FAA has agreed with them that after these accidents where it was deemed that there was an illegal charter taking place, they've pretty much said, hey, it's the pilot in command's responsibility to determine if that's a legal charter or not, right? You can't claim ignorance on that fact. You just can't. That's no protection for you as the pilot in command, so you have to ask those questions. And if it's debatable at all, then you're going to have that tough conversation with the owner or whoever's been hiring you, however you got to that aircraft, to say, hey, I'm uncomfortable doing this unless I have more data. This seems like this isn't legitimate. I would rather, step back, and I just can't fly this flight, and that's a tough thing to say, right? It's easy for me to sit here and say that that's what you need to say, but it's a lot harder when you're a hungry commercial pilot trying to build hours, and you know that if you say no to this client, you might lose out on, maybe all of your livelihood right there of how you're making money. And that can be a scary thing. So it's really important to have this type of conversation with clients before you start getting involved in pilot services. So when you're giving pilot services, it's really important is, hey, do you ever let anybody borrow this aircraft? Are there any lease agreements or other owners that use this aircraft? Kind of what's the nature of that? Those are all questions you want to ask before you get started doing the pilot services game. Something I did for a long time and still do from time to time. So if you have questions on pilot services, like Chad did on dry leases, ask away at the Discord or send me an email. All right, so for the next topic, this came up in our Discord channel, and it was a question over, should I get a second opinion? And I don't have anything to go with this, John, so on the screen here. But should I get a second opinion on my training? So basically somebody's coming up to their Checkride and they've only flown with maybe one or maybe two instructors up until they're ready for the private pilot. And that instructor is saying, hey, you're signed off, or I'm ready to sign you off. You've met all the requirements. You're ready to go to your Checkride. And the question was basically, should I get a second opinion before I go to the Checkride? And I just wanted to use this as a public service announcement to say, absolutely 100% always get a second opinion before you go to a Checkride. Because here's the deal. If you are a brand new private pilot, or even maybe an instrument and commercial that you've worked with the same instructor, you haven't gotten kind of an outside opinion other than when you've taken a Checkride. And if you're a private pilot, maybe never. maybe the person that's been sitting to your right this whole time for the past few months is the only person that you've ever flown with. And so when you go to the check ride, you're going to have a new person sitting over there for the first time. And already it's a check ride. So the check ride is nerve wracking, right? Anytime you take a check ride, especially the private pilot, you're going to be nervous. That's just something that happens. And I try to dispel as much of that nervousness as possible by kind of pulling the curtain back behind, what the background of the check ride looks like, kind of from a DPE's perspective. I do my best there, but I'll be honest, it's still going to be something that causes nervousness. So that's totally normal. But you also don't want to combine that nervousness with also being the first time that you've flown with somebody other than your primary instructor. And then your primary instructor is a human being, right? They can make mistakes. So if they forgot to cover something, or they taught you something slightly different, or maybe they have a different understanding of what the airman certification standards does, it could be any number of things. If you're relying 100% on them, you go to the check ride, you could be faced with a big surprise of like, oh, wow, my instructor never taught me that. And you didn't get a second opinion. So basically the holes aligned and that was able to slip through. And now you're facing a disapproval, and you're learning that you had that gap in your training through the disapproval process and retraining, which goes on your permanent record, versus just flying with a new instructor to get a second opinion and identifying it that way, which of course that doesn't go on your permanent record. That just makes you a safer pilot. So I think flying with a couple of extra instructors throughout your training, especially towards the end as you're preparing for your check ride, is really, really important. And preferably go out and fly with an instructor that is maybe slightly removed from your training system. Meaning that if you're, let's say you're working at a one flight school and you've got two instructors that have been doing a lot of your training. Let's say one has been doing the flying and one's been doing a lot of the ground. It's kind of the same group of people. I would reach out even beyond that flight school, or maybe another instructor you just haven't had a lot of contact with, and really get a second opinion, right? I would really want to be vetted that way. And hopefully your school is already doing this for you, right? A lot of Part 141s, they're going to mandate this in the way that they execute their syllabus. You're always going to fly with somebody different on your recommendation ride. If you're flying at a smaller Part 61, they may only have one or two instructors for you to choose from. So in that case, I would say, hey, I want to fly with an instructor from outside the school even. And that may require a little bit of coordination, obviously, with the school of saying, hey, y'all have done a great job. I feel like I'm prepared, but just to make sure, I'd really like to get, this person from another school, or this person that's a friend and happens to be a CFI. I'd like to get them to give me some training, right? Just on the off chance that I've missed something here. And that kind of acts as a lot of times this is called a mock check ride, right? You have an instructor that comes in that's really not instructing, they're really just evaluating your knowledge. So they come in and they pretend to be an evaluator, and really they're acting as a true evaluator, just not in a formal sense. And they evaluate your knowledge and they make sure you're in the right spot. I'm actually starting a little bit of a new service. This is the first time I've really talked about it publicly. I'm doing a virtual mock check ride, and I've got the Zoom set up, and we've got a process where this is going to go through. So look forward to more details there. But even if you can't find another instructor, doing some sort of kind of mock oral exam with me virtually may be a good option if you don't have another instructor. And obviously I can't go up and fly with you, but I think there's even some opportunity to do that in a kind of a flight sim environment, maybe to do it virtually, some way to get a second opinion there. But at the very least, participating in these live streams and watching my stuff on YouTube, making sure that you've got a good understanding of the ACS. If you feel like your CFI, maybe, a lot of CFIs I've heard will just hand you the ACS and say, hey, read this ACS. That's what the test is going to be on. Well, I've said it a lot, of the ACS is kind of like reading the phone book. It's kind of difficult to glean any meaningful information if you don't really know how that ACS works. So that's why I produce all the content I do on how to read the ACS. So that's all I have to say about that. Let's move on to the last topic, and this one's going to be fun. It's this came up just today, just a few hours ago. Do you need a manifold pressure gauge? And this really wasn't even the main question. It just came up in one of our Discord channels. I think it was the instrument Discord channel. Yeah, the instrument pilot discussion. Somebody had a question on the 66 hits, which didn't make, it didn't make sense to them, and we were clarifying that, and they commented on how, let's see, this is Winston. I don't know Winston's name, but his handle on Discord, Winston. But apparently Winston likes to overthink things a little bit, and we thought it was a little funny, and to make it even funnier, he mentioned something about how, well, I used to think that manifold pressures were required except for, for all engines and not just direct drive engines. And I kind of laughed. I was like, well, that's not exactly correct either. It doesn't have to do with a direct drive or a geared drive. And we started off on this rabbit hole, nothing against Winston, because I realized, yeah, this is kind of confusing here on when a manifold pressure is required. And in the process of answering this question, I kind of realized, hey, there's some things that I could probably talk about tonight that would clarify this for people on not only if manifold pressure gauges are required, but also how to use this website, the ECFR.gov that I'm on. So if you're joining us on the live stream, I got ECFR pulled up. This is my favorite site to pull something up. And let me show you something. If I just Google search 91205, because of how Google works, the first thing that pops up is this law at Cornell, the Cornell Law School. They've got some great search engine optimization because I see the Cornell Law School pulled up as a reference all the time during the Checkride, or when somebody has a question, they'll send me a reference, and they always pull up this Cornell Law School, and it's because it's the first result on Google. Meanwhile, usually the second result is the actual Code of Federal Regulations from the U.S. government, the .gov website. And so that's what I want to first point out is use the .gov website. The ECFR.gov website is really good, and everything you need to know, all the current FARs are there, as well as the historical. And we're going to talk about that real quick. So let's just try to drill down on, does your aircraft need a manifold pressure gauge? So required aircraft equipment is in 91205, right? And in 91205, number 8 is a manifold pressure gauge for each altitude engine. Okay, well, what the heck is an altitude engine? Right? Thanks, FAA. Thanks for being super clear, because I don't think I've ever heard of an altitude engine other than this reference of the FAR. So for that, we have to go back to the beginning of part 1, and we have to go to definitions. And altitude engine defined in the definitions means a reciprocating aircraft engine having a rated takeoff power that is producible from sea level to an established higher altitude. So an altitude engine is an engine that can create sea level pressure at an altitude above sea level, basically. Now, this is totally unrelated, but right below that is the definition for an amateur rocket. And an amateur rocket, among other things, cannot reach an altitude greater than 93.2 statute miles above the Earth's surface. That definition just blows my mind. I would never have guessed. If you would have said, hey, Seth, what's the maximum altitude an amateur rocket can go to? I would probably guess like 10,000 feet or something. I would never in a lifetime had guessed that it's 93.2 miles. That just seems crazy high for an amateur rocket to go to. So again, totally unrelated to the answer, but I always think about that when I look up the definition of altitude engine because it's right below that. So I just thought that was funny. Okay, so now we know two things. We know what an altitude engine is, and we know the maximum altitude of an amateur rocket. So let's go back to the altitude engine. So an altitude engine is simply an engine that can that's boosted, right? That's the colloquial term here, is a boosted engine. So essentially, there's two ways to do uh, an altitude engine. You can have a turbocharger or you can have a supercharger. Now, a turbocharger, there's different kinds of turbochargers. One of the most common kind you'll see is a turbo normalized. And a turbo normalized engine is just a reciprocating engine that has a turbocharger and something that's called an automatic wastegate. And so what that does is sea level pressure is essentially, we'll just call it 30 inches or 2992, right? Yeah, everybody knows 2992 is the standard altimeter. So if you're flying an aircraft that has manifold pressure, next time before you start the engine, if it's not digital, look at the manifold pressure gauge and you'll see that it's reading about 30 because that's standard sea level pressure, right? It's about 30. So we'll just say 30 because that's easier to say than 2992. So a normally aspirated engine can produce 30 inches. So as soon as I go up 1,000 feet, usually I lose about an inch. So at 1,000 feet up, I'm only making 29. And at 2,000 feet, I'm only making 28. So on and so forth, right? So if I climb up to 10,000 feet, instead of making 29 inches or 30 inches of manifold pressure, at full throttle, my engine can only make 20 inches of manifold pressure, right? Well, that's important because especially on a constant speed a constant speed, aircraft or constant speed propeller driven aircraft, 20 inches of manifold pressure, that's a pretty low power setting. So I'm reaching kind of the maximum altitude where I can really affect a good climb. So what a turbo normalizer does is when I reach 1,000 feet, right, I lose the manifold pressure, but the wastegate opens up a little or closes up a little bit, and it's boosted 30-inch pressure back to the engine. So I'm 1,000 feet above sea level. Instead of making 29, I'm making 30. And then at 2,000, I'm still making 30. And I'm making 30 all the way up to my critical turbocharger altitude. And usually that's around 10,000 feet. So at 10,000 feet, I'm still making 30 inches, right? And now at 11,000 feet, I'm only making 29. So on so. So now at 20,000 feet, I'm making 20 inches of manifold pressure. I might only be making 10 inches of manifold pressure, right? So that's allowing me to fly much higher, and that's why turbochargers are great for flying high, because they provide me with that capability to fly at a much higher altitude. So turbo normalizers only ever feed standard sea level pressure or lower to the engine, never more. Now, a turbocharger that's not turbo normalized, it might provide 40 inches of manifold pressure at sea level. So instead of making 30, it's making 40, maybe 50, maybe 60. Kind of depends on how much boost you're actually. And superchargers do the same thing. Now, the difference between superchargers and turbochargers are run by the exhaust. So we take that exhaust that's coming out of the engine, right, our combustion cycle. We've got our intake, compression, our intake, ignition, compression, exhaust, right? And that exhaust has a lot of pressure, right? There's a lot of pressure that's an explosion coming out, getting pushed out by the engine. And so instead of just dumping that exhaust overboard, we run that exhaust over a little turbine. And that turbine is connected via a shaft. So you have a hot side of the turbine that's connected to a shaft to the cold side. And so that turbine is running a little compressor, and the air coming in from the outside is then compressed by that compressor and fed it into the engine. Now, a little bit about turbochargers, of why, they're some of the failure modes and the problems with turbochargers is because I'm running that system with the exhaust. That exhaust is like 1,400 degrees. So that turbine is moving at very fast. It's moving around 30,000 RPMs. It's building up a lot of heat, and also it's being run by air that's 1,400 degrees. So there's a ton of heat that gets put into this turbocharger, right? And some of that heat gets transferred over to the cold side of the turbocharger. So the turbocharger's compressing air, and that compressor is actually pretty hot. So it's also heating the air up. On top of that, Bernoulli's principle says that when we compress air, we also increase its temperature, right? So just the simple act of compressing the air makes the air hotter. So now our engine is getting 30-inch, it's getting compressed air, but it's getting hot compressed air. Well, our engine doesn't like hot air, it likes cold air. So we're taking like 3 steps forward and 1 step back, if you will. That's a good way of thinking about it, is we're getting this nice compressed air, but it's hot, so it's not quite as good. So more modern turbocharger systems or really souped up aircraft might have another component called an intercooler. And so it takes a turbocharger, it compresses the air, right? This air is really hot, so it compresses it, heats it up, then cools it off via the intercooler, and then feeds it to the engine. Well, that causes extra resistance, so there's no free lunch, right? Everything has a trade-off. So now the engine's getting slightly cooler air, but it's also not as compressed because I had to run it through this intercooler, so that's wasting a little bit. And it also increases the back pressure, and I lose some efficiency there. So these are all marginal gains of performance. But a lot of the RAM conversions for like a Cessna 340 or something will have the integration of that intercooler in there. So that's a little bit about turbochargers. The other thing about turbochargers is they're running at a very high temperature, and you don't typically have some sort of fire detection system in a lot of turbocharged aircraft, which is a concern that I have when I'm flying a turbocharged aircraft, is that turbocharger is acting like a jet engine, but I don't have the fire protection or the fire bottles, like a halon bottle that I could shoot into the engine should that turbocharger fail. Because if that turbocharger fails, now I could be sending 1400-degree air inside of that engine cowling, and it'll start melting stuff. I've had this happen where a turbocharger, the intake part of that turbocharger came off. And so I was spitting out, or the engine was spitting out hot exhaust air into the engine cowl, and it melted all of the engine diagnostic lines. All the probes got melted off, and part of the scat tubing for the cooling, and it started to smoke a little bit, and I had to shut the engine down to keep it from causing a fire. Had I been in a jet engine, I would have had some sort of fire warning that pops up and says, hey, your engine's on fire. Well, I don't have that with a lot of turbocharged aircraft, so that's another problem. Okay, then you have superchargers. Superchargers do the same thing turbochargers do, but instead of being run by exhaust air, they're run directly by the engine, either through a belt system or a direct drive on the engine. Now, the trade-off with a supercharger is it's going to be, first of all, it's more complex, right? I've got to gear it to the engine somehow. Okay, the second reason that the trade-off, the second big trade-off is in order to turn that supercharger, I'm using power from the engine, so that power from the engine is not going to power the propeller. So I'm giving up horsepower to turn the supercharger. So the returns that I get on the supercharger aren't 1-for-1, right? It's a little kind of like a turbocharger. I take 3 steps forward, 1 step back. I'm not getting everything. I have to trade off some of that power to run that supercharger. Superchargers are typically pretty uncommon in general aviation. There are a few Cirrus SR-22s that had a supercharger STC. I don't know how popular that is, but that's the only kind of modern-ish aircraft that I know that's running that on a 100 low lead engine. Now, some of the diesel-powered variants that are out there, those are supercharged. Now we're getting into areas where I'm uncomfortable talking about because I don't know exactly why a lot of the diesels are turbocharged or supercharged, or the difference, the benefits and takeaways from that. You can even have turbo supercharged. You can have both. So that's something that you could have on both. I don't know of any general aviation aircraft right now that are both turbo and supercharged, but a lot of the older bombers, radial engines, they would have both turbochargers and superchargers. And so the other benefit of superchargers is I can turn them on and off, versus a turbocharger is basically, as long as the engine's making exhaust, it's spinning the turbine, which is spinning the compressor. And so sometimes I can have a manual wastegate that I referred to before on the turbocharger, and that wastegate I could control directly. So I could just dump all of that boost overboard and not use it to run. So effectively I'm normally aspirated. So I can sort of turn it off, but that turbo is still out there spinning at 30,000 RPMs. With a supercharger, a lot of those I can literally just turn off. I'm disengaging the supercharger clutch system, opens or whatever, and it stops moving. So that, superchargers could be a little bit safer maybe. I don't know, that they're more complex, they're heavier. But those older World War II aircraft, they would have both. And those engines would be making like 100 inches of manifold pressure. And that's how those bombers were flying up at pretty high altitudes for, piston engines, having those big radials. But those engines would basically eat themselves up after a couple of flights. I mean, you can't run, anything over 50 inches. That's a lot of boost to be running on an engine on a regular basis. So, they were eating through engines a lot with having both systems in there. Anyway, that's the discussion about altitude engines. So to get to my point, we had a discussion on, this is what happens when I don't have detailed notes, is we wound up talking for like 20 minutes about what a turbocharger and supercharger are. And now I'm finally getting to my point here of why we need a manifold pressure gauge. So 91205 says that we only need a manifold pressure gauge for aircraft that have turbochargers or superchargers, effectively, right? An altitude engine. Well, if you've flown any complex aircraft with a constant speed propeller, you know that pretty much every aircraft out there with a constant speed propeller also has a manifold pressure gauge. So where in the rule book does it say that we have to have a manifold pressure gauge for a constant speed propeller driven aircraft? And a lot of people will say, well, it's in the KOEL or the type certificate data sheet. And that is true for some. You can look in the KOEL or the minimum equipment list, or you can look in the type certificate data sheet. But I pulled up the TCDS for Cessna 182. And to find the TCDS, let's look at the FAA's website is the drs.faa.gov. So if you just look up FAA DRS, that'll be the first link, and it's the dynamic regulatory system. And then over here on the side, you just type in TCDS. So we got TCDS here. We'll pull this up, and then we can search for TCDSs here. And so we could just look for CE 182. Let's see if that pulls it up. Let's do a search. So that's a PA 23250. That's not it. Part 23. That's a 172. Here it is, a 182. So the TCDS number is a 3 Alpha 13. So we pull this up. Here's all the Cessna 182s. And if we do just a search for manifold, and it doesn't pop up. We can do a search for gauge, and it only mentions a couple of an oil gauge and a fuel gauge. So there's nothing in the TCDS that says you have to have a manifold pressure gauge. Well, this aircraft, the 182, it was certificated under Part 23, and it says that at the very beginning of the TCDS. Actually, over here, when we did the search, it pulls up that this was actually looks like Car 3 is what it was used. So it was a very old one. But Part 23 is what the more modern versions would have used as well. So we could look in the ECFR website that I told you about, so ecfr.gov, and let's pull up Part 23. And Part 23 is our airworthiness standards for normal category airplanes. So if I wanted to search Part 23 for manifold pressure, I would click on this first link, and it's going to open up the whole Part 23. So you can see how many pages are here. We got hundreds of pages, and then I can do a Control F, and I can do manifold search, and nothing's going to pull up. Gauge, nothing's going to pull up there. Well, I can think, man, somebody told me that it's in part 23. I wonder if it's in a historical version of part 23. So over here on the ECFR site, this is why I want you to use this site, is we can go to date. We can click on the calendar here. We're going to open up this date, and we're going to go back as far as we can. And it looks like the furthest we can go back is January of 2017. That's the oldest kind of archive that we have of part 23. So we're going to pull that up, because all we're seeing is, like, has this ever been a part of part 23? So then we're going to search for manifold. There we go. All right. So for manifold, propellers not controllable. Manifold's showing up several times. And here we go. For reciprocating engine-powered airplanes, number 5. So this is, finally we've gotten here, ECFR 23.1305B5 from January 3 of 2017. A manifold pressure indicator for each altitude engine and for each engine with a controllable propeller. So that's how you look up a historical version of part 23. Now, the important thing here, I promise this has a point. The important thing to know here is part 23 has these historical versions because that's how planes used to be certified, right? And in this case, back in 2017, if I was building an aircraft, I would have to build it in accordance with this rule right here. Now, most aircraft that we're flying in the training world right now, we're probably certified under CAR 3, which you notice we couldn't even go back that far in history. So to look up those historical documents, maybe I'll do an episode on that. It's even more difficult. But what the FAA has done over the past few years, and they've done this with basically all the certification documents, and this is maybe a little bit of speculation on my part of exactly why they're doing it, but I've talked to other people in the industry, and I think they agree, is primarily the FAA, instead of saying exactly what the engine needs as far as the gauge goes, they're just saying it has to meet a certain level of performance. So rather than telling manufacturers, hey, you have to have a manifold pressure gauge if the propeller is controllable, they would rather say, hey, if you need to have a way to derive the power output of an engine and read that on a display, say something like that, right? You want to have that ability. And whether you do that through a manifold pressure gauge or some technology that we haven't even heard of yet, or hasn't been invented yet, that way we can adopt newer technology maybe a little bit quicker. And that may sound kind of crazy if you know the FAA very well. You're like, what? The FAA hates new technology, right? But I think they are actually a little more cognizant than you would imagine. So with all this powered lift stuff that's coming out, these little taxi services using kind of big quadcopters, if you imagine like that's what I think of as the power output for them is going to be a lot different, and probably a manifold pressure gauge wouldn't be really useful. And if they have a controllable pitch propeller, then why would I have a regulation that says they need a manifold pressure gauge if it's an electric plane, right? So it doesn't make much sense. We need to change the rules to make it more performance-based instead of dictating the specific widgets that have to be on an airplane. They just instead make the manufacturer meet a certain performance level, and then we'll go from there. All right. That was a long way of answering that question.
And it was that Steve Stinger asked if you actually had any sport pilot applicants that you ever done, Seth.
Yeah, I've done maybe 4 sport pilot Checkrides. So yeah, the joke is with sport pilots, there are at least dozens of you in the country. So.
Isn't that a joke for recreational pilots? I think there's more sport pilots.
Yeah, there is more sport pilots. Recreational pilots, I don't even know if there's dozens. There may be less than 12. I really don't know. There's nothing.
There's really very few of them.
Yeah.
Oh, G Flight on YouTube is saying that he is ready for the ATP check ride and he has all the requirements satisfied except the flight portion. He asks, what is the best way to prepare for that, and if you offer prep instruction prior to the practical test?
Good question. I used to do that. In fact, I started kind of the professional aspect of VSL Aviation started as an ATP prep course because I did a lot of military aviators that were getting out of the Air Force, and so they didn't need any of their requirements. They just needed training in an aircraft they could afford to go take the check ride in. Because at the time you had kind of two options. You could go take the check ride in like a Seminole or a Travel Air or a Seneca, and it would cost like $8,000. Or you could go to a company with a Level D simulator and pay like $20,000 and get the ATP done. You'd also get a type rating out of it. So that was a good deal, but it's obviously pretty expensive to pay $20,000 getting out of the military. You don't have like $20,000 just sitting around. So most people did the option of learning how to fly a small aircraft, proficient enough to meet the ATP standards for the check ride. The ATP Airman Certification Standards, that's part of the ACE guide, but essentially it's like instrument and commercial check ride all folded in together. So you're doing 4 approaches, you're doing some air work, some stalls, some landings, but it's primarily an instrument check ride kind of on steroids. So instead of the 3 check rides required for an instrument check ride, the ATP requires 4. It requires that you do it in a multi-engine aircraft for the multi-engine ATP. And then there's some different requirements in there. So to answer your question, there are a lot of multi-engine schools out there. There's not a lot of multi-engine schools that are comfortable getting you prepped for the ATP. So you can go to the VSL website. I've got 4 recommendations there of schools that know how to do ATP prep work, and I do check rides for all of them. And I've got some other friends of mine that are DPEs that also do those check rides. So that's a good place for you to look there is find those recommendations on the VSL website, or you can reach out to me, just send me an email and I'll send you those contact directly.
All right. Jesse Cruz is a CFII with a TAA Piper Cherokee. He's been toying with the idea of using it to teach commercial and instrument students. Apart from insurance and 100-hour inspections, does he need to file anything with his local FSDO? It would be a part-time operation as he has a full-time separate job.
No. Nope. Nothing you need to file. You are legal to do a Part 61 flight training operation, even if you own that aircraft. You're legal to do that as far as the FAA is concerned. Now, I would check with your airport because your airport may require you to have a business license. They may require you to have commercial insurance. It would be a good idea to have commercial insurance. Of course, you already mentioned that. So other than just local, municipal business licensing, no, there's nothing that you need to file with your FSDO.
Do you watch any aviation YouTube channels?
I'd occasionally, but I mean, I'll watch some aviation YouTube stuff, but I don't like follow any channels really. I follow a few content creators and I can't think of Steve-O. I used to watch his stuff, his flying the TBM, mainly because of like, the TBM's such an awesome plane. So I won't watch a full flight, but occasionally I'll watch his stuff. Flight Chops has some great stuff. He's the Bananas. I forget his name. He used to be a Spirit pilot. He flies the J3. He's got some stuff on Instagram that's cool. Free pilot training. That's a friend of mine is Josh. I actually gave Josh Campbell runs the free pilot training YouTube channel. And I actually gave him his initial CFI. He was in my C-130 reserve unit in Little Rock. And that is how I met him. And so before he even started that channel, I I've already been working with him, and we did a CFI, so we've got kind of a long friendship there. So watch his stuff. Yeah, and there's probably a lot of other ones that I'll watch, but I don't follow necessarily.
Captain Shaquille Oatmeal has a question about if you have any tips for a multi-engine check ride.
It's a great username.
Yeah.
Multi-engine check ride. So let me switch this up to the ACE
Oh,
guide. And
actually, there's another question about an MEI check ride coming up on Thursday, and if you have any tips or advice. That second question clarifies that they're doing it in a DA42.
Okay, cool. So if you have the ACE guide, that makes it pretty easy. You go to the CFI ACS, and then you click on the blue airplane, and it takes you to page 98, which is the additional task table. So for the check ride, you're required for the MEI add-on, you have to do area of operation 2, tasks C, K, and P, and then some stuff from area of operation 5, 7, 9, 10, 12, and 13. And these are all hyperlinked in the ACE guide, so you can just kind of hop back and forth and see those really easily. Looking at the ground, where that's going to come from, you're going to have to cover the runway incursion avoidance topic again, and that came up in the Discord today, actually, I think, of somebody asking, hey, why do we have to talk about runway incursion avoidance as an MEI? We already did it for your CFI. Why do I have to turn around and do it again? Well, you also have to do it for your double I. It's because it's a special emphasis area. We have so many runway incursions that the FAA wants all of our instructors to always be talking about runway incursion avoidance, a way to mitigate it. So we have to talk about that again. We have to do endorsements and logbook entries. So this applies to kind of both questions for your commercial and for your MEI multi add-ons. Know what kind of endorsements are needed. There'll be some time where you have to spend, especially on the MEI, with the examiner asking you, hey, okay, I want to get my commercial multi add-on. What endorsements do I need? What do I need to go out and fly this? They may present you with a couple of scenarios where you have maybe an owner-operator that bought an airplane and he wants to be able to fly it by himself. Is that something that he could legally do? If so, what endorsement would he need? So for that, again, ACE Guide makes it easy. I can just go down here to the 65J current endorsements, and I can go over to the endorsements section here where the solo for new category. So the solo for new category is in A72, so to act as a PIC of an aircraft solo operations when you don't hold appropriate category and class. So you could give, let's say a new owner bought a DA42 and he wants to fly it by himself to train, and you giving the training where you're comfortable doing that, you could give him the Alpha 72 endorsement. He could go out there and solo that as much as they want. They're not a student pilot anymore, right? You don't have to give them the 90-day endorsement, right? So just to be clear there, you're not making them a student pilot. You're just giving that additional endorsement. However, most of the time that endorsement's not necessary because we're not actually soloing the plane prior to the check ride, mainly for insurance purposes. Although it's legal, there's just not many insurance companies that would let you go out and solo a twin without the rating. So that's not happening very often. So normally you would have to get the additional category and class endorsement. So the 6163 is what would require that. So that's a big tripping item for an MEI, is knowing why 6163 does that. So the link here, and again, ACE Guide's great because it takes you right to the ECFR. So if we're doing an additional aircraft class or category, those are the two options, it's category or class. Now, if we're going from an airplane single engine to multi, that's a class. And so we'll look through here and we can see we need not meet the specific training time requirements prescribed by this part. So what does that mean? Well, that means if we go back to Sorry, I didn't switch my screen share there. So that's what 6163 says. So if we take this and pull up our commercial regulation, which is we can find in 61-129 of the FARs, you can tally this up, and it basically says that you need around 20 to 25 hours of multi-engine time. Well, most multi-engine courses are only going to take, 6 to 10 hours, maybe 15 hours, depending on where you're taking the check ride, all that stuff. So you don't have to meet the 61-129 standards if you're doing this as an add-on, because 6163 says that. So I would expect you as an MEI to know why 6163 alleviates you from having to meet all the training prescribed in 61-129 or 61-109 if you're doing it at the private category. So those are some things I'd expect you to know. The FAA has a great book. It's integrated into the ACE guide, of course, but it is the Flying Light Twins Safely, and I never can find that right here. So the Flying Light Twins Safely goes through all of the, if you can construct a lesson out of the Flying Light Twins Safely handbook here, you're going to be successful in the oral, but for both the multi add-on and the MEI. So as a multi add-on, if you can understand all the concepts that's listed in here, then you're good to go. The other place to look for the commercial for your pre-flight, let's see, multi-engine operations right here. Your VMC demonstration, that's all talked about in the airplane flying handbook as well under Chapter 13. So Chapter 13 of the airplane flying handbook is transitioning to multi-engine airplanes. So that and Flying Light Twin Safely are kind of your two source documents that you'd be using for both of those check rides. So that's that. When I see people struggle on the multi add-ons, it's typically they're struggling with the single engine instrument approach, because you're dealing with asymmetric power. And if you get behind a little bit, now that CDI starts to drift and we get off of that, the standards here. So let's look at that too while we're here. We'll go to multi-engine operations, one engine inoperative. Yeah, instrument landing with one engine inoperative. Let's zoom in here. So skill 9, on final approach, maintain vertical as applicable and lateral guidance within 3/4 scale deflection. So if you go beyond 3/4 scale deflection, you're technically violating the ACS skill section, and that could lead to a disapproval. I say could because momentary deviation away from this, if you're making a correction back and it's just really crosswindy that day and you're putting in your crosswind controls, kind of making these small bites, and you bump into that 3/4 scale deflection, maybe go just beyond it, but you're making a correction back and you get back and you're calling it out, doing your best. Maybe that's still okay, but I still wouldn't want to mess with that. You want to be able to consistently be a 1/4 scale deflection, both lateral and vertical on the way down on that single engine approach. And what I tell my applicants is if it starts to look bad, as long as you catch it prior to the final approach fix, so outside the FAF, if you decide, hey, I need more time for this approach, I need extended vectors, something like that, then everything's copacetic. That's fine. That's not going to result in a disapproval most of the time. There's always exceptions, I guess. But most of the time, that's not going to result in a disapproval. But if we're inside the final approach fix, and because of something you did or didn't do, we get more than 3/4 scale deflection, there's no correction happening, that's automatic. That's a disapproval. And, I'll tell you then, we'll go around using both engines. You can come back and finish everything else, and we'll come back, but we're going to have to come back and do a single engine approach. So that's typically where people struggle on that check ride, is the single engine approach. So make sure you get enough iterations to be comfortable there. Right.
One thing that I will say as well is technically as a commercial multi-pilot for your add-on and for your MEI, you have to be provided ground and flight training in things that a lot of times get overlooked. Things like ground reference maneuvers, I believe, are a part of the ACS and the ECFR for it, right?
Are you saying for the multi?
Yeah. Because there's a lot of like single engine stuff that also applies to multi-engine stuff that, because it's not required as an add-on rating, people don't do it, and they don't do it as training, and they don't log the flight when the ground training, and that has caught people with the DPEs that are more observant.
Yeah. No, I definitely see what you're talking about. Yeah, to pull up the flight instructor ACS here, the multi-engine, the multi-engine operations don't require any ground reference maneuvers, but let's say you're doing your multi as your initial CFI, right? So if you go to your CFI ACS and you look at your performance and ground reference maneuvers, on ground reference maneuvers, at least for the initial exam, if you're doing it in a multi, there is no exception anywhere that you don't have to do these in a multi. So I don't know if the FAA meant to do that. The old PTS was written a little bit differently. It had two PTSs. There was one for single and one for multi. But the CFI ACS, there's only one of them. And so just like you're saying, John, there are some things that in theory could get looked over because we're so used to doing the add-on that we forget that there's these other things that are important that you need to know how to do if you're doing it. If let's say you're training somebody as their initial instructor in a multi, which is rare, but it's not unheard of. So yeah, make sure it's everything's spelled out in the appendix section of the ACS. And if it's not in the appendix section, it will be in the specific section, such as, Area of Operation 13. If you look at Area of Operation 13, it says, hey, the evaluator must assess all tasks in Area of Operation 13. But if we go to our add-on, like it's asterisk, and again, verifies that, hey, if we're adding on a multi, we still have to do everything in 13. But I'm just rambling now.
Yeah, I think it was something that caught me on my multi-engine add-on for my instructor rating, was that the ground reference maneuvers are required for a multi-engine class rating. For a private pilot rating, as an MEI, you have to have received training in that, because you could theoretically be teaching somebody's private pilot multi-engine rating.
Yeah, exactly. I saw a good question from Walid Khatib. I don't know. I need to stop trying to say these things in YouTube. And he asked, can you explain how far into an instrument approach, final approach fix, initial approach fix, or missed approach point do you have to fly for it to count as an approach for IFR currency if you're doing the approach in VMC versus IFR conditions? So that's a great question. We can look at the ACE guide again for this, because in the attachment section here, I've got an info 150.12. And you'll hear me complain about how the FAA communicates regulations, and this is one of them. I wish they would just spell this out in the FARs, because a lot of pilots haven't even heard of an information for operators. But I can't change the way the FAA does certain things. So this came out in September 2015, and this basically asked clarification exactly what you were asking for, is how far into the instrument approach do I have to fly for that to count? And essentially, it says as long as you transition from IMC into VMC on the final approach course, then I can count that towards my currency. All right, so basically inside the final approach fix. If I break out and I'm somewhere inside the final approach fix, then I can count that approach towards my currency if I'm flying in actual IMC conditions. Now, if I'm with a safety pilot and I have foggles on and I'm doing simulated instrument conditions, then I have to fly that approach all the way down to minimums and or the decision altitude, right? So I either have to go missed at decision altitude or I break out and I can land at decision altitude or my MDA. I can do either one of those. So I can log it there in simulated conditions. But if I'm doing it for real in IMC conditions, just anywhere along the final approach course. And that's outlined in that info for operators 15012.
We're getting a lot of questions about like just general tips and advice for Checkrides, specifically commercial ones. MTAS 172 was just beyond continuous studying. Do you have any recommendations to help him better prepare for a commercial check ride, which is I assume this is an initial check ride, specifically with the oral portion?
Yeah, so I'm sure if you've done all the basic studying, you've done the mock orals, all that, I would say focus on, if you've done all the stuff, focus on scenario-based questions. Like those are really important. Try to ask 4 different scenarios on like, hey, would this be legal? Type of thing. Like, how would I make this happen? So I'll give you an example. One of my scenarios would be, hey, we're flying on 172 and my wife shows up. I'm hiring you to do this. So it's pilot services. So then we have that conversation. Is pilot services legal? Of course, for the most part it is, right? But you need to know about me as the aircraft operator, operational control, all that stuff. So then you move on of, okay, we're going to do this flight. My wife shows up and she's got way more bags than what you thought. So how are you as a commercial pilot going to make this flight happen? Because I'm trying to evaluate your decision-making ability when it comes to a commercial operation versus just a private pilot operation. And the difference is, and this is kind of those honest conversations I like to have, but the difference is you're being paid to do a service, right? You've got to get the airplane from point A to point B. That's how you're making money. There's no question out there that we're doing this as a business endeavor, and you don't make money by saying no or I can't do that, right? You make money by saying, well, here's how I can do that. And that's an important distinction, right? I'm not asking you to just automatically say yes to everything and be unsafe. That's not at all what I'm saying. What I'm saying is, as a commercial pilot, you need to be much better about finding out how you can do that thing safely. So if you show up and you got a 172, my wife has all this baggage she wants to bring with us, and it's too much for one flight, well, then the how is, well, we're going to have to make 2 flights. Okay. Or we might have to carry much less fuel than what I'm used to. So I try to back you into a corner where you have to determine what your minimum takeoff fuel is, right? I think I've talked about this in an episode, but if not, I could talk about it just for a second. And that is, most pilots have a minimum landing fuel, right? You've thought about, I'm always going to land. It's a Cessna 172. A lot of the times I hear 10 gallons is my min landing fuel. And of course, our minimum day VFR is 30 minutes of fuel, and night or IFR is 45 minutes. But most pilots round up to an hour of fuel, and then they round up even a little bit further, and then they just call it an even 10 gallons. Okay, fine. 10 gallons is your min landing fuel. I turn around and ask, well, what's your min takeoff fuel? And why does that matter? Well, as a commercial pilot, your min takeoff fuel matters quite a lot. And the most common answer I get is, well, it depends. My min takeoff fuel depends on my flight. And I shake my head, no, it doesn't. Your min takeoff fuel is just like your min landing fuel. It's a static number. It should never change. Your min takeoff fuel is your min takeoff fuel. So what is it? And most pilots haven't even thought about this. So the way I like to think about min takeoff fuel is Okay, if my min landing fuel is 10, then my min takeoff fuel has to be at least 10, right? It can't be less than that. Well, could it be 11? Well, not really, right? Because as soon as I add power and start my climb out, I'm at 10, and I'm in theory now I'm going to land below my min landing fuel. So that's not going to work. It can't be 10 gallons, can't be 11 gallons. So then you think about, well, what's the shortest flight I could effectively ever take? Period. What's the shortest flight I would ever plan on taking? And the answer probably is, well, one lap in the pattern. Okay, well, one lap in the pattern takes, let's say, 10 minutes. And then what's the worst thing that could happen? You take off for your lap in the pattern and somebody crashes on final right behind you and they fought out the runway. And now you're going to have to divert to another field and land. And let's say in general, and this is where it may vary depending on your airport potentially, but in general, I would want about 20 minutes of holding fuel, right? 20 minutes of holding fuel for my one takeoff and landing. And so 10 gallons, and let's say, just to make the math easy, that that 5 gallons is going to be my 20 minutes, right? I'm rounding up here. So I wind up with 15 gallons as my min takeoff fuel, long story short. So in a 172, 15 gallons is my min takeoff fuel. So that's the least amount of fuel I can have in the tanks to even think about dispatching a flight. Well, how far can you fly on 15 gallons of fuel? Right? That's the next question. And well, fly for about 20 minutes, right? And I still land with 10 gallons in the tank. So by having my min takeoff fuel, I'm basically saying this is my maximum useful load that I can give you, right? My maximum useful load is dependent on my min takeoff fuel. So that's an example of how I gave you a scenario, and I want you to think through it as a commercial pilot and give me an answer of how you're going to make this mission happen, either by carrying less fuel, making more fuel stops, because you don't want to just arbitrarily carry less fuel and land with less than the VFR required reserves, right? And to be clear, that 1 hour of landing fuel, that's a personal minimum, right? That's not a legal minimum. So that may be a question I ask you in the Checkride. What is the legal minimum fuel you could ever take off with? And so the proper answer would be, well, 30 minutes plus whatever it takes to fly one lap. You could come up with, I don't know, 8 gallons, 6 gallons in 172, something like that. But anyway, I'm digressing there a little bit. The point of the exercise is to get you thinking like a commercial pilot and not just saying, no, I can't do that, or no, we're not capable. I'm not going to give you a scenario as an evaluator that we're not capable of doing. Right? That'd be pretty silly. So if I give you a scenario, there's a way to do it. I want you to think about how. And that shows me that you understand the rules and how to implement them and how to mitigate risks. And you can kind of think like a commercial pilot. So that's my favorite way to give a scenario. So that's something that your instructor should be doing for you, is kind of giving you these challenges of, hey, how would we do this? And it's not impossible. There's a way to do it. It's kind of like a puzzle. But get you thinking about kind of the whole picture of how the rules and regulations are all working together for you to execute a safe flight. Got a question. Jason Lewis on YouTube asked, which instruments do you prefer to fail during a practice IFR approach? Non-precision versus precision. And per the Airman Certification Standards, if you look in Appendix 3, back here in the non-precision, it says the applicant must fly one procedure in reference to non-precision approaches only. You have to fly must fly one procedure with reference to backup or partial panel instrument and navigation display, depending on the aircraft instrument avionics, representing a realistic failure mode for the equipment used. So I bring that up because if you're practicing the instrument Checkride correctly, you need to, and also for the double I's that are studying out there, CFII, in order to do an IPC correctly, the partial panel approach needs to occur on the non-precision approach, not the precision. So that's not directly related to your question, but it's tangential to that, and I thought I'd bring that up, is the non-precision approach has to be your partial panel. So on a precision versus non-precision, sure, on practice you can fail either one. It really is greatly dependent on the aircraft's avionics. So for the G1000, I'm trying to perfect this. I think I'm going to purchase the stickers that they make to cover up certain things on the display rather than just turn the display's dimness down or turn it off and using the big red button. Because in a realistic scenario, you're going to have your PFD, you're just going to lose your attitude information, potentially your altitude, airspeed, and you're going to have to refer to backup instruments for that. And it depends on the failure mode. So it just depends on what type of instruments you have on board the airplane, on where I'm going to fail. Some of them, if you fail, if you fail both the primary, the attitude and the CDI, and you don't have a backup, let's say your CDI is also your DG, it's like an integrated HSI, and you don't have a backup CDI, then you're having to use the 430 for lateral guidance. And that's kind of difficult for me to do. I'll still do that on a Checkride and expect you to use the lateral deviation on like a Garmin 430, for instance. But if you don't have a 430, you have no way to tell. There's basically no way for you to shoot a partial panel approach unless you're doing some sort of radar approach, as far as taking out your DG too. So in that case, I might just take out your attitude indicator, and in addition to your attitude indicator, you maybe lose your VSI or something. Try to make it as realistic as possible with some challenge there. But that's why most aircraft are going to have another nav, CDI that's independent of your turn coordinator, not your turn coordinator, your directional gyro. There we go, your DG. So I don't really have any favorites.
Yeah, what I see a lot of people do is the attitude indicator and the directional gyro, because those are theoretically both vacuum instruments. So it simulates that you've lost your vacuum system, but in a lot of newer planes, you have some kind of redundancy there. They're all solid states, dual G5s or something like that with no vacuum system. So realistically, if your attitude indicator fails, your HSI shouldn't probably fail as an entirely separate system.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the problem I'm running into, is there'll be like 2 Aspens or 4 or 3 or 2 G5s and a GI 275, and they're all redundant. And so it's like the ACS says it has to be a realistic failure. Can I really say that, yeah, all of these instruments with integrated battery backups are all going to fail and go blank? And it's like, well, if the plane's just simply not capable of doing a partial panel approach with all of those failed and it's legal, then obviously I can't do that in a Checkride, because then there's no way for you to fly an approach. So
I'd say probably the most realistic one is like a pitot tube blockage or something like that.
yeah, there was tragic event I talk about a lot. It happened near my home airport a few years ago. A guy crashed a Cirrus, and it was a fatal and got killed in the accident. And he'd left the pitot tube cover on the Cirrus SR20 and took off with the pitot tube cover and panicked. And the plane was perfectly flyable, but he didn't have airspeed indications and basically panicked, and he stalled the aircraft and crashed. So very tragic accident. So now on all of my CFI rides, either the CFI or commercial, I'll cover up the airspeed indicator, and I'll just have you fly the airplane without an airspeed indicator. It can be done safely. So if you have an experienced CFI, that's an excellent exercise for you to do, is go out and do a lap in the pattern without an airspeed indicator. And what you'll find is it's pretty easy.
There's 2 questions that are kind of along the same lines. One was, if you're doing a check ride for a private pilot, would you ask about the different types of hypoxia? And the second question was, for a private pilot check ride, would you expect them to perform stalls in a turn and or straight and level only? And so the reason I think that they're somewhat similar is they're kind of coming down to DPE preference. And just because it's in the ACS that you need to know it, does it actually mean that you need to know it?
Yeah, I pretty much, as a rule, I always have you do at least one stall turning. And so let's go to the private pilot area of operation. This is 7, task B, which are power off stalls. So that's where it talks about stalls. And then skill 6 is maintain a specified heading if in straight flight, and then maintain a specified angle of bank not to exceed 20 degrees if in turning flight while inducing the stall. So that's both in the power off and the power on. So skill 6 for both of those specifically calls out doing the stall in a turn. So you need to be prepared for both of those. And what I strongly caution you on is, let's say you've got one of those examiners where they're like, oh yeah, Ed never has you do it in a turn. And so your school's like, or your instructor's like, hey, Ed doesn't have you do it in a turn. Don't worry about it. Well, just because your examiner doesn't, because they do have the option, they can do either one. But just because your examiner is not going to do it in the turn doesn't mean you don't need to practice that. So I think practicing getting out of a stall in a turn is a really important skill, because in a turn, that's most often when you're going to have an aggressive wing drop. And if you try to correct that wing drop with aileron at a slow airspeed, you're going to go into a spin. So you need to kind of habitualize that stall recovery where you're neutralizing the aileron and using a lot of opposite rudder of whatever way you're banking to correct for that while you decrease back pressure, add full power. You're almost doing kind of a stall recovery / spin recovery, kind of melding those two together. And obviously, the only difference between a stall recovery and a spin recovery pretty much is what you're doing with the power. In a spin recovery, you're going power idle. In a stall recovery, you're going power, full power. So if I feel a big shift in the bank of the aircraft and I hear that stall horn, I'm immediately thinking spin. So I'm going power idle. If I just hear the stall horn and I don't feel any banking happening, I'm thinking stall, and I'm going power full. That's kind of how I'm thinking about things. But you need to practice both of those. So the other part of that question, power on, power off stalls, the other part was hypoxia. So for that's an area of operation 1, task H, which is human factors. And the only time I would ask about the different levels of hypoxia is if on your written test results, I saw that you had missed the question that's basically PAIHK1A, which K1A is the knowledge test code for hypoxia. That would probably be the only time that I ask about the different levels of hypoxia. I'm typically not, that's not part of my plan of action, is really dig in, because really it doesn't really matter that much of the different levels of hypoxia. I'm not necessarily sure that makes you a safer pilot. I mean, it makes you more knowledgeable for sure, but as long as you can identify hypoxia and then you know what to do in the case of hypoxia, it's like, that's what I really care about. Whether that hypoxia was caused by somebody drinking too much the night before or caused by them just not handling altitude well because maybe they've got some sort of heart condition or something. There's a lot of reasons you could have hypoxia. I'm really more concerned about, hey, can you tell me, here's some symptoms of hypoxia, and then what you would do if you thought you or your passengers were experiencing hypoxia. So I don't have time on the practical test to go through all the iterations of all of these. Because let's say I were to go down the rabbit hole of hypoxia, and then I talk about, well, how do you explain hyperventilation to me? And then the middle ear and sinus problems. List all the reasons you could have middle ear and sinus problems. List all the spatial disorientation. I mean, we could be here for hours going over all the human factors here. So I have to narrow it down And the way that ACS helps me do that is they just say, hey, pick at least 3 of the conditions above. Talk about 3 of these conditions. And then we're going to move on. And the main thing is, can you perform a self-assessment for the flight or a simulated flight by the scenario? So now, just like I said with stalls, just because I don't ask about the different forms of hypoxia doesn't mean that another DPE, maybe they were like a hypoxia scientist and they really like to know about that. That sure, then maybe you need to know all those different types. So just because I don't ask it in my particular plan of action doesn't mean you don't need to know all those types. You've been listening to the VSL Aviation Podcast. I really appreciate everyone being here, joining us on Discord, interacting. I do have some time tonight, so what we do after this is we stop the live stream, and stop recording, and then I kind of open up the room and can chat for a little bit. I try to do this a few times throughout the week, either on this Discord channel or a couple of other Discord channels that I'm on. So if you want to, have those kind of behind the scenes conversations, then join us on Discord. You can find information on that at vsl.aero. Once again, I thank everybody for joining us on these live streams and podcasts. Don't forget to like and subscribe, 5-star review, all that stuff on the YouTube and the podcasts. And I hope to see you next week. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll see you.